coincidentally, on the Newsmaker line with me, I have Steve Quayle. And Steve, I know you've heard about the death of the Russian ambassador to the UN, and I mourn that death because I had a lot of respect for Vitaly Shurkin. But I'm getting connections from what people are telling me back to General Flynn, back to the Russian ambassador to the U.S., where they were all sharing Pizzagate information. And now this ambassador is dead before he can share it with the General Assembly. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, Dave, I believe that what we're seeing is the true revelation of just how wicked the leadership of the United States is, as well as other nations. I mean, let's look at the complete takedown, if you will, of NATO from the internal immigration invasion, let's call it, or invasion of immigrants, because I don't think people recognize that what we're watching is the New World Order destroying the Old World Order, and the heads of the countries, for instance, Angela Merkel, obviously we were seeing the gentleman Hollande in France. We've watched the Norwegians, the Swedes, and by the way, that's a bunch of lies when the Swedes said, oh, everything's fine, we're not having terrorist incidents. They have capitulated to militant Islamic domination, okay? Remember, this is what's happening, but nobody ever puts it in the context of NATO. And fascinatingly enough, when I see, as you did, clustering of Vitaly Shurkin, by the way, he's probably, in my opinion, one of the most well-spoken, past tense, very engaging and intelligent men. Look, you can admire someone for their qualities, but someone's trying awful hard. And do you believe, Dave, and I know you do, but these people, these entities from hell, these political piranhas in the Potomac of self-indulgence, there's a lot of alliteration, are absolutely prepared to go to war to disguise and to hide their global pedophile child sacrifice network. Now, I won't use the word Pizzagate unless I define it. I'm talking about the global trafficking in children for sexual and ritualistic murder, and this is what's going on. Now, if you knew, and I knew, and we knew what was really behind the scenes, the people are scrambling. There are people in the most powerful positions on this planet, multiple continents, pretty much on every continent, that are involved in this, and it is the most horrific, disgusting, and disturbing, I would say, news that's come out. You know, I've been speaking a lot about cannibalism, and even today I put up a story. I believe it got jammed so no one could look at it, but about basically a doctor who's dissecting human cadavers for children. So what's happening, in my opinion, is we have a love affair with death, okay? That is my opinion. And if everyone would rethink to about a month before President-elect Trump, got the election. You remember, Dave, when Putin said flat out that if Hillary Clinton got to be the president, there would be nuclear war?
Yes,
do you remember that?
I
and I did a show on it, and I know you wrote about it. So the idea here is simply this. There is no coincidence, okay? Let me share that. Just like the dead scientists clustered around the microbiologists that we talked about probably 20 years ago, was the Star Wars scientists that were disappearing. Now you've got 4, if you will, Russian senior level statesmen slash spokesmen slash ambassadors that are dying of unusual circumstance. 64, by the way, is no time for him to keel over and have a heart attack. And here's something that you and I have to answer for the listeners tonight. Who has the most to gain by initiating a nuclear war between Russia and the United States?
The military-industrial complex, yeah.
Yep, but also the globalists, because, and this is what I think, Dave, we have to hammer home to everybody. In order, according to Islamic theology, in order for the Mahdi to come on the scene, there has to be a global nuclear war. You're even seeing it in the challenging of Iran, basically saying to the United States, we're not afraid of you anymore. And you're seeing it all over the world. And again, the state of affairs, now you know this, and I've said this on your show, and you've written about it from your own perspective also. We believe, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that the introduction and the immigration of basically fighting-age men was brought in to set up an internal revolutionary army that would be if you will, armed and trained within the boundaries of the United States to be released at whatever the go point is. So what you're seeing, in my opinion, you're seeing the wars within our borders being planned for, implemented, and armed for, and then the wars trying to initiate with Russia. Look at, Donald Trump made a powerful statement, and what's wrong with this? What is wrong with trying to get along with Russia and not dictate to Russia when, if you look at their defense systems, and, I'm back in that world, Dave, of monitoring different missile systems, different fighters, and by the way, I would love to have a new MiG personally, but I'm sure that's not going to happen. What a wonderful airplane. And meanwhile, we're in a Navy that basically has almost, 25% readiness. Our military has been destroyed internally from the Obama that made the nation desolate, the abomination of desolation. And we absolutely are watching Republicans in name only, or can I say this, traitors in drag, okay? And that, I won't go into detail, but kind of go with that, with the thought. We have people now that absolutely do not understand nuclear weapons, do not understand to the degree that the exchange isn't popping a few shots over the border or ducking a few missiles. We're talking about global nuclear war. This isn't a scare tactic, but again, if people don't understand that Islamic theologies demand that there be a global world war in order to bring about the Mahdi, and if you'll remember, Ahmadinejad was even volunteering the lives of 50 million Iranians if that would bring about the Mahdi's return, and unfortunately, for him, about probably 48 million didn't like that idea, and he was replaced. So if you look at the ideas now of global revolution, global war, global pandemic, every place you look, and I'm sorry, but this is a testimony to the times we live in. Everything is no longer the same. It doesn't matter if it's volcanism, which there are multiple volcanoes going off in multiple countries almost daily or every other day. We're seeing weather wars and weather modification, and for the record, there's 200 U.S. patents. Dane Wigington on geoengineering, geoengineeringwatch.org has got, I think, a page that lists, dozens and dozens, at least 100 patents. Then we've got chemtrailplanet.com. And, Dave, I don't know if you run into people like this, but I still run into people that don't have a clue about chemtrails.
Yeah.
They absolutely do not have a clue about it. And I thought after all this amount of time, it would be a given that people would get it. But, boy, I don't know about the people that you run into in your email and just talk to on the phone, but I can't believe how many people still don't get it.
Steve, there's a whole generation of people that know nothing but chemtrails. The old jet contrails that you and I grew up with, that's been replaced now, 20 years of chemtrails.
Absolutely. And I think you know this, Dave. I was the guy that first brought that to talk radio. The reason I say that is because 23 years ago, I was describing it in detail. I was quoting generals. I was quoting U.S. patents, for instance, 4686605, the HAARP patent, and the High Altitude Active Auroral Research Project in Alaska, GACONA. Obviously, Nick Begich came out with his book, Angels Don't Play That Harp. And, there are so many, if you will, people talking about it, but they don't realize now we are seeing it in real life. You can quote, I did it, Dave, on the book I wrote, Weather Wars and Unnatural Disasters. I quoted source, footnote. Secretaries of Defense claiming not only can they manipulate the weather, they can initiate earthquakes, they can initiate volcanoes. One nation can make war on another, quote, secretly, and not anymore. I mean, it's an open, how do I say this? It's open knowledge in the circles of special operations and, the black budget militaries of the world, what's going on. And my question is, and has always been, what happens when you've got everybody bombarding the ionosphere, heating it up, so to speak, steering all of the rivers of water, the rivers in the upper atmosphere, and that's what even the Weather Channel and others are calling what's happening in California. Well, we've got now total weather chaos, and geoengineering plays a horrific part in that. So, we can try and eat organic food. We can try and, and we should purify all water. I make this statement: no one should drink water unless it has a closed source, it stays underground, and they can track it. Because if you don't know what you're drinking, it can hurt you. They're changing, Dave, and I want to share this with people that still don't understand what chemtrails are. Go to geoengineeringwatch.org. Go to chemtrailplanet.com and start to see all of the amazing and voluminous amounts of research notes, sources quoted, and then tell me it's not changing. I get this famous email once a day. I saw the most beautiful rainbow the other night, unlike anything I've ever seen. And I said to this person, who was a lady, ma'am, that's not a rainbow. That's a chemical diffraction pattern from the chemical constituents or the compounds that they're spraying in the chemtrail spray. It's geoengineering, but I called it, Dave, and I still call it this, terror forming, Terror forming. You generate, it's basically the equivalent of a giant Hegelian plot playing out. You create the problem, you provide the solution, and providing the solution, you get the desired results. It's basically you create conflict, you provide the solution to the conflict, and then you've achieved your goal in the solution that you provided for the conflict to bring about the total enslavement of mankind. And it's just like Fukushima. I really want to touch on that. Do you remember when basically, and you dealt with it, wrote about it, I dealt with it, wrote about it, we both talked on different shows we were on, but you remember when even the number of reactors was being suspect, if you will. They wouldn't admit to the amount of reactors, let alone the MOX reactor, the breeder reactor. The idea here is simply this now. The Pacific Ocean, I don't know the total percent of death in it, or the total percentage of death, but you cannot separate cause and effect. They're even raising the lethal dose exposure ratings and hiding the true amount of emanations coming out and the radionuclides and the radioactive particles coming out of Fukushima that are now settling on the west coast down into the west coast of South America. So Fukushima, some people call it an extinction level event. What I call it is a people, how do I say this, a depopulation process going on right before your eyes. And so now when you come up with a geoengineering nightmare, you combine it with biological pathogens that are binary, for instance, Ebola pox. That's one of the things that the Russians developed. And, Dave, even when Ken Alabek came to the United States and testified before, one of the committees in Congress, that even our military wouldn't acknowledge the fact that Ebola and smallpox had been combined, let alone the Novichok, which, forgive my Russian, but basically means newcomer series of biological weapons. And then we've got our government experimenting on our citizens,
yes,
whether it's the veterans and all of the Gulf War syndrome stuff, whether it was the phony anthrax, and I say phony. One only has to deal with the dying words of those who fought with their country, and basically they call you and say goodbye, and they say, it all started downhill for me, Steve, when I took this shot. So I don't know about you, Dave, but I'm tired of saying goodbye to brave men and women because of a policy that sees our men and women as nothing more than guinea pigs. And under the Obama administration, medical care was withheld, and you probably saw the story where, interesting, the veterans' hospitals, many of them in specific locations, are running out of medicine. Well, we saw that happen, and we saw the whole painkiller issue. Some of these men and women, in order to stay alive and just exist with their pain, they need their pain medication. Look, I pray, and I really do. I wish I could go into every veterans hospital with the power of God and heal them all as Jesus did. Now, I'm not Jesus, okay? But I'm saying I wish that could happen. But in the meantime, to see someone suffering in pain and not try, by all the grace that God's given us and the ability that he's given us, to go in and just make someone just a little pain-free, it is the greatest travesty in the history of this country. And now we've got warmongers, and I'm telling you this, going to war with Russia, obviously the throw weights of the missiles, Russia's capability, and I know we have secret stuff. Good night. You and I have talked about it on your show. But if the people that control our secret stuff are the ones behind the push for the New World Order, what makes anybody think we'll have time to use it? And so we are sitting ducks outside of the grace of God, and sitting ducks become dead ducks when someone gets mad enough to say, it's over, I'm tired of this foolishness. So, the reports are coming that something's gone on in the Arctic. Obviously, a nuclear event has taken place in the Arctic. We're getting so much radiation beyond Fukushima, and there's nothing but lies. So here's the thing I think people have got to make the bridge over troubled water, if they will. The mainstream media has done nothing but lie. They will never tell you the truth. Anything that will affect your life, your family's life, your well-being, you're kept in the dark, and you're fed, manure. They may put the manure on a sterling silver teaspoon, but at the end of the day, it's still manure. And people are saying, we don't like the smell of manure, we don't like the taste of manure, and basically, we're not going to allow you to shove that down our throats any longer. So then they take control of the dialogue. The dialogue basically is simple. We determine what you get to hear, not you. The people have risen up and said, we know what's going on, and we no longer believe your narrative or your horse manure, And so right now the horse manure is hitting the fan, and people are beginning to recognize, listen, you cannot have the control of all the major news media outlets in this country under the control of 6 globalist corporations that are flat out New World Order, God-rejecting, embracing, if you will, Islam until the time they decide to take out Islam. We're watching Albert Pike's Third World Vision, the Third World War vision that he wrote about, and people say, well, it wasn't him. Well, whoever it was that wrote it, somebody's sure following the playbook. And now notice this. Notice who hates Donald Trump. Well, the more that I see who hates him, the more I like him. And I went on record 14 months ago, even before he was even taken serious, and saying, I like the guy, and the reason I like the guy is because everybody who hates him are the ones that we all talk about. Good night. 23 years on talk radio in my case. I don't know how long you've been on, but we've been warning and warning and warning. And people, when they see, I would say this, the stoppage of this planned slaughter for God's people, and notice this too, Dave, that the Department of Homeland Security was basically headed up by Muslims.
Yes.
Do you remember when there was a breach on 20 million records of our veterans?
Yes.
And
China.
and Office of Personnel Management?
Yeah.
I had a lieutenant commander call me, Dave, and say, Steve, they got our DNA, they got our retina scans, they got everything. They can do anything, and they know where everybody's at. So I would say this. Imagine people that have that information, that hate you, hate me, hate them, and when they're given the go signal, the intel they possess already.
Yeah, well, I believe that information went to the Chinese, if I'm not mistaken, on the veterans.
Well, it wasn't just the Chinese, Dave. It was basically out to the highest bidder, and quite candidly, it was given to the people that even control ISIS behind the scenes, okay? Now, you've probably heard me say this, and I think you've alluded to it, and you probably said it yourself, but I'm just telling you, terrorism always has a funding source. These guys just don't, they just don't grow up to blow up. They get others to blow up, and they basically bank up. In other words, terrorism is always, if you will, the stealth hand of a very deep pocket behind it, initiating conflict, obviously turmoil, obviously terrorism, and obviously, if you will, projecting a series of events that result in fear. And when people see the events, they want to be protected from that fear. And the people have become, in essence, we've become, instead of the rugged individuals that our parents and grandparents were, we've become pretty much, a bunch of soft, if you will, not only soft, but and what would I say, apathetic and indifferent, and with cognitive dissonance that would make total distortion in the space-time continuum seem like a clear picture, okay? In other words, we exist in an unreal world that is basically being fed perpetual signals and noise, all having effects on people's brains. And people, fortunately, some people are starting to break out of it, especially the young people. Because, look, when the power goes down, their identity, whether they've assumed an identity in some role-playing game. By the way, I know nothing about video games. I've never played one in my life except Pong when it first came out. I have, I know people love it. I have a friend, a relative, who stays up until he crashes 24 hours straight playing video games around the world. And the guy's 65 years old, okay? So what I'm saying is simply this, that we have been divorced from reality, and those who are not divorced from reality are the ones that are working their plan behind the scenes. So, Dave, when you warn, I warn, we all warn. It's to try and give people a heads up. I'm afraid that until an event happens beyond 9/11 that impacts people's lives, they simply are going to go on in denial. And, now that Donald Trump got elected, they think somehow everything's fine. And my statement, and I said it on your show before, I'll say it again, God gave us a battle. Now we're thrust into the full-scale war.
I totally agree with that. And I want to go back to something you said to me earlier, and I want to reiterate it here. We're coming full circle on knowledge. And you mentioned to me one time about God is going to reveal the sins of the leaders. And I think this reflects back on Pizzagate and the murder of this Russian ambassador.
Absolutely. Because, again, we're to the point that, how do I say this? At what point, Dave, and let me rephrase my statement with a question to you, because I'm sure you asked yourself this too. At what point do people finally say, I get it now. All these murders, there is a globalist plan to take over and take down. As Michael, Savage said, borders, language, culture. When you get rid of the borders, your language, and your culture, what do you have? You have exactly what France has, Germany has. You have the end of Western civilization. And, the point that I think everybody's got to recognize and understand is we're there. And those who, want, I don't even think, Dave, that people have a clue of what nuclear war with Russia will look like, okay? And I don't care who in the Defense Department says what, but we've got, we have no greater than 50% readiness in any of our armed services. Maybe it's less now, but less than 50%. So you've got basically China, who has a 1,000 years of history just watching us self-destruct. And the point is that they're basically challenging us now, and the Iranians are challenging us. The Russians own the Arctic. I want to make that clear. The Russians own the Arctic. We have, I think, 2 icebreakers. They have 4 with 2 new nuclear icebreakers coming on out of the production. They've moved so much materials in the Arctic. And by the way, with all of the ionospheric heaters, in other words, the weather modification and control weapons going on, that's the reason why it's getting so warm in the Arctic, in other words, in the area of the North Pole. And isn't it fascinating? The North Pole is warmer, last month than places in the lower 48?
Yeah.
So I think it's got to dawn on people, and I don't know. You're a better judge of this probably, because you probably have your finger on the pulse of people more. I'm trying to deal with the supernatural realm, and that's really relevant now. And yet, in your opinion, are more people getting out of their mindset of denial?
Right now, absolutely, without question, but there are degrees of being awake. There's the I know something.
Okay.
I know something is wrong. I know we're being lied to. We're run by crooks. That's a low level. And then there's the level that you and I interact at. It's we understand who's behind this, and this is a war between good and evil, Satan and God, and we really understand what it's at stake. And then between is everybody else. I would say right now, about half the country has some degree of awareness of what's going on. I would say about 10 to 15% fully understand the nature of the conflict.
Well, and you may be generous at that. You know, the point that I guess that we will see, is it not astonishing to you that all of the Republicans that are basically supposedly bastions of Republican thought, and by the way, this is not a Republican Democratic statement, you know, the idea is simply this, that those who are clued in, those who are cued in, and those who have been paid off are doing everything they can to thwart President Trump. They're doing everything they can. And so I believe, and I'm asking every Christian that will listen to this to pray, that God will bring total exposure to the pedogate and also to the true motivation of some of the loudmouth senators, who basically they protest too much. Especially, look, you've got pictures that you've put on your website, you've addressed it of McCain, arming ISIS. You remember how much flack we got? I mean, I remember almost going to blows with a former friend of mine when I said, do you know who controls ISIS? Do you know who created ISIS? All of the stories come out, all the people that were the paymasters come out and say it, and still people say, nah, we didn't do it. And Dave, I'm getting the brutality is increasing. And when you got people being chopped up in America, their heads, cut off in America, disemboweled, and I'll just stop there, and some of the most gruesome, horrible, wicked, there's no word to describe it, demonic, devilish, hatred, contempt for mankind and human beings going on, and still people don't take notice or even stand up. I think, unfortunately, most people are in a rut. And the only difference between a rut and a coffin is a footboard and a top on, a board on the top of the rut. So people have to stand up, get out of the rut, and get going and saying, like, what does my life count for? What's really important to my kids and grandkids? Where am I going to be when this whole thing goes down?
I could not agree with you more. I want to return to this final thought, Steve, and it's this. I agree with you. There's going to be exposure. It's underway, and it's not going to stop with the Clintons. It's going to go far higher. What is Donald Trump waiting for? There's enough actionable information now to start making big-time arrests. Why do you think he's hesitating?
I think he's hesitating because he's got to give his new Attorney General, he's got to allow them to investigate outside of the realms of betrayal, leaks, and everything else, okay? And what I'm saying is I believe he needs to act, and I believe he needs to act now. One of the things I've suggested is he goes into the State Department. He brings in, because they have, whatever their security clearances are, he brings in the experts. They put them on voice stress analysis. And by the way, there are more sophisticated, lie detectors than the ones you see. But, voice stress analysis, and basically ask them to reconfirm their commitment to the Constitution of the United States. Do you remember, Dave, when we first started talking, 8 years ago, when it was stated that Obama had people take an oath to him and not the Constitution?
Yes, I do.
So, look, if they can't take an oath and if they can't pass a lie detector test, sayonara. And, someone says the surveillance society. Well, look, when you control the flow of surveillance information, you basically control people's lives. And that's why, trying to get people to understand the level of sophistication and surveillance is kind of like a losing theme, a losing thought, because, again, most people who I say this, who should be worried, aren't, because they think there's nothing to do, but nothing they can do. But they can do it. They can challenge the leftist narrative. They can say to CNN's advertisers, we won't buy any of your stuff. They can say to Disney, ABC, we'll never go to your, theme parks again. They can say to all of the network scumbag shows, and even Fox has got to be told they need to call in that show on Drew Barrymore where she's a cannibal and her husband gets, people that she eats and supposedly be, it's funny. What they're doing, Dave, is they're perverting and they're absolutely tearing down every single taboo to now that it's the appetite of devils expressed through humans, that demons and the devils, two different things, hate humanity. And therefore, when they devour humanity, they not only, they're not satisfied with just killing. They want to consume. And if people would understand that if they don't stand up, they will be consumed, first of all, intellectually, and then if they don't get with it, they probably end up, in somebody's takeout lunch menu. And that's what's happening to all these beautiful little children, and how it breaks my heart that the people of God, especially the mainstream big-mouth churches with all the 50,000s or however many people go to them, they're not crying out to God for God to intervene. So may the faithfulness of the intercessors and people who know their God, which are strong and will do exploits, call on God to bring this whole thing out, because you cannot do it as a man. And I believe that God is himself waiting to see if his people will once again cry out to truth, or they'll just go back into their passivity and basically do nothing.
I guess very well said, Steve, and that's a really good place to leave this interview. I wish you safe travels, and I really thank you for joining us.